The fog had not lifted from the moor by the time the chapel bell rang, and Eleanor Prynne stood at the altar of Ashcombe Hall in her mother's gray traveling dress, because there had been no time to have anything finer made. Rain ticked steadily against the tall old windows. 3 servants sat in the front pew as witnesses, their faces arranged into the particular careful stillness of people who did not know whether to be glad or afraid on this of all mornings. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, held a candle, though the morning was bright enough without it, because habit at Ashcombe Hall ran toward small defenses against things no one named aloud. The man beside Eleanor was a stranger. He was tall, and he stood with the exact stillness of someone accustomed to holding a line under fire, his dark coat still creased from the mail coach, his jaw shadowed with 3 days of road dust he had not paused to shave. He had arrived at 9:30. The ceremony was to begin at 11. In between, a solicitor named Mr. Pemberton had explained to him, in the clipped, unhappy voice of a man delivering news he wished someone else had written, that the late Earl's will permitted no delay, that the 30th day from his uncle's death fell that very afternoon, and that if the marriage clause went unmet before the sun set, Ashcombe Hall and every soul depending on it would pass to his cousin, Edmund Vane. Eleanor had not chosen this. Neither had he. That fact sat between them now like a third person at the altar, and neither looked at it directly. Above them, the chapel's small stained window threw a single blue shape of light across the stone floor, the only ornament the old building had ever possessed. And Eleanor fixed her eyes on it through the whole of the ceremony, rather than on the stranger's face beside her, because it seemed, in that moment, the safer thing to look at. An encumbrance passed to him like a debt not yet settled, Lady Augusta Vane had said to Mrs. Hartley in the corridor outside the chapel not 20 minutes before, believing herself unheard, her voice pitched low and pleasant, the way cruelty in that house always was. One does hope he takes the burden gracefully. Eleanor had heard it through the half-open door. She had smoothed her mother's dress with hands that did not shake, because she had learned long ago that a Prynne raised on charity did not have the luxury of trembling where anyone could see. The vicar spoke the words. Julian Vane, newly the 8th Earl of Ashcombe, repeated them in a voice so level it might have been reciting a muster roll. And when he took her hand, his fingers were cold, and his grip was careful, as though he feared he might break something he had not yet had the chance to look at closely. He did not meet her eyes until the very end, when the vicar pronounced them wed. And in that half-second before he looked away again, Eleanor saw something pass behind his face that she would spend the following weeks trying to name. It was not distaste. It was not indifference either. It looked, more than anything, like a man bracing for a blow he believed he had already earned. Outside, past the chapel's narrow windows, the moor rolled gray and silent toward the wood where 3 heirs to Ashcombe had died within a decade, and the servants who murmured about a curse over Ashcombe Hall's kitchen fires would have said, had anyone asked them that morning, that the house had simply claimed its 4th bridegroom before it finished with him. Eleanor had lived at Ashcombe Hall since she was 12 years old, the orphaned daughter of the late Earl's dearest friend, taken in not from sentiment. The old Earl had told her plainly once, in his blunt and honest way, but because a promise was a promise, and he intended to keep his, whatever it cost him, with his own sister. She had grown up in the space between family and staff, dining with the household on ordinary days and at the Earl's left hand on Sundays, learning the estate's ledgers before she learned French, because in the last years of his decline, the old man trusted no one else to keep them honest. She knew which tenant families needed their rents held back a season and which merely wished to be asked. She knew where the roof leaked and where the old Earl had let the timber rot because he could no longer bear to walk the east wing and see it repaired. She had buried him herself, in the sense that mattered, closing his eyes and writing the letters, while his sister Lady Augusta arrived 4 days later, dressed in mourning too fine for genuine grief, and asked, within the hour, what was to become of the girl. What was to become of the girl had been decided, it turned out, by a clause the old Earl had dictated to Mr. Pemberton in his final month of failing breath. The estate would pass to his nearest male heir, his brother's son Julian, presently a captain of dragoons on the peninsula, on the sole condition that he marry Eleanor Prynne within 30 days of the old Earl's death. Should the marriage not occur, the entail would default to the son of the Earl's younger brother's widow, a young man named Edmund, whom Eleanor had met twice and trusted not at all, a soft-handed gentleman who had once asked her, at a Christmas gathering years before, whether she did not find it tiresome playing housekeeper to a house that would never truly be hers. She had thought of that question often in the weeks after the old Earl's death, turning it over the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. She had never wanted Ashcombe Hall for herself. She had wanted only to be permitted to stay in the one place that had ever felt like home. And it was a strange thing to learn that her guardian's final act of love toward her had been to make certain of it in the only language the law recognized, a husband's name beside her own. She had asked Mr. Pemberton, in the numb week after the funeral, why her guardian had bound a man who did not know her existed to marry her, rather than simply providing for her, as any decent guardian might. Mr. Pemberton had looked at his hands and said only that the old Earl had wished her protected by more than an allowance, that an allowance could be contested and a wife could not, and that he believed, though he had never said so outright, that his nephew Julian was a man worth trusting with the task. Julian himself had been 3 weeks reaching them, delayed first by his commission's release and then by weather on the roads north, and had walked into a house he had not visited since boyhood, already legally obligated to marry a woman he had never seen, on a schedule that left no room for acquaintance before vows. He had not complained. He had not asked to delay it by so much as an hour. He had simply stood in the hall reading the will. Mr. Pemberton handed him, gone very still, and said, "Then we had better not keep the vicar waiting," in a voice that told Eleanor nothing at all about what he felt, and everything about how carefully he had learned to conceal it. The days after the wedding settled into a strange, careful quiet. Julian took the master's rooms in the West Wing, and did not once, in the first week, set foot east of the long gallery, where the family portraits hung, and where, Mrs. Hartley told Eleanor in a low voice one evening, the old Earl's elder son had died in a fall from his horse 11 years before, in the wood just past the garden wall. Julian's brother. Eleanor had not known there had been a brother. No one at Ashcombe spoke of him, the way no one at Ashcombe spoke of the 2 deaths that had followed his, the old Earl's own son lost to fever 2 years later. And then, this past autumn, the old Earl himself, sliding out of the world with the particular exhausted relief of a man who no longer wished to be the one left standing. On the second evening of the marriage, Julian found her in the estate office long after the household had gone to bed, a ledger open before her and a single candle burning low. He stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him, and when she looked up, startled, he did not apologize for the intrusion, only crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the columns of figures she had ruled with such care. "You keep these yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. Someone had to, once my guardian's hands grew too unsteady to hold a pen. I did not mind it. I found I had a talent for it that no one had troubled to notice before. "I noticed within the hour," he said. "Mr. Pemberton warned me the accounts were in some disorder before he handed them to me. I have found nothing of the kind. It was the nearest thing to warmth he had offered her since the chapel, and Eleanor felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs before she could guard against it." She closed the ledger carefully and rose. and for a moment they stood close in the candlelight, near enough that she could see the tiredness at the corners of his eyes. The road still in him, though he had been 3 days at rest. "You need not thank me for doing what was already mine to do," she said. "I am not thanking you," he said. "I am telling you, I see it." He hesitated then, as though the sentence had cost him something to say, and stepped back before either of them could decide what to do with the space he had just closed. "Good night, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name. She lay awake a long while after, listening to his tread in the corridor beyond the connecting door neither of them had yet opened, and told herself firmly that a single sentence was not a foundation to build a marriage upon, even as some stubborn part of her began, quietly, to hope otherwise. 3 heirs in a decade. The tenants called it the Ashcombe curse without any real belief in curses, the way people call a run of bad weather an act of God, more out of habit than conviction. Habits took root all the same in a house like this one, and Eleanor had watched 3 under-housemaids give their notice in as many years, each of them citing a sick mother or a better position, none of them quite meeting her eyes when they said it. She had learned to read the fear underneath the excuses, the quick glance toward the east wood before the girl climbed into the carrier's cart, and she had stopped, after the second departure, trying to talk any of them out of it. Julian did not speak of any of it. He rode the Boundaries each morning before breakfast, met with the steward, reviewed accounts Eleanor had kept meticulous for 4 years, and said nothing about them beyond a short, "These are well kept," that made her absurdly, uselessly glad. At dinner, he was courteous. He asked after her day. He never asked after her heart, and she told herself she did not expect him to, because a marriage contracted between strangers on a solicitor's deadline was not the sort of thing that came with any promise beyond a roof and a name. The assembly rooms in the market town were modest by London standards, a single long chamber with a musician's gallery at one end and a fire too small for the crowd it was meant to warm. But the whole county turned out for it twice a season all the same, and Julian's first appearance there as the new Earl drew every eye in the room the moment he and Eleanor crossed the threshold. She wore her mother's gray silk turned and retrimmed with a length of ribbon Mrs. Hartley had found in a drawer, and she was conscious, walking the length of the room on Julian's arm, of exactly how plain it looked beside the satins around her. 3 weeks into the marriage, Lady Augusta found her opportunity. She arrived on Edmund's arm, resplendent in jet beading that caught every candle in the room, and steered a visiting baronet's wife directly toward Eleanor, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 40 years arranging rooms to her advantage. "You must meet my nephew's little bride," Lady Augusta said, her smile warm and her eyes entirely cold. "My brother's ward, you know. Such a fortunate arrangement for her, the encumbrance the will forced upon him. Though I am sure she does try to be of use about the house." The baronet's wife made a small, uncomfortable sound and changed the subject to the weather. Eleanor kept her chin level and her hands folded and said nothing at all, because she had learned at 12 years old that arguing with Lady Augusta in public only fed her, and it was only later, in the carriage home, with Julian silent beside her and the moor sliding past dark and featureless, that she let herself feel the sting of it. "You did not correct her," Julian said, after a long while. "There was nothing to correct. She is not wrong that I came with the house." "She is entirely wrong," he said, and something in his voice was sharper than she had yet heard it. "About what that means?" He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. The carriage rolled on through the fog, the lantern swinging its narrow light across the hedgerows, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, and thought about the particular quality of anger she had heard in his voice, not on his own behalf, but on hers. and wondered when precisely a marriage contracted by a solicitor's deadline had begun to feel like something closer to a defense mounted in her favor. She did not ask him that either. There would be time enough, she told herself, though the moor outside gave no promise of it, rolling dark and featureless toward a house that 3 men had already died trying to keep. The flood came in the 2nd month, a hard week of rain that swelled the beck past the Tanner cottages and left old Mrs. Tanner and her 2 grandchildren standing ankle-deep in water with nowhere dry to sit. Eleanor heard of it from a breathless stable boy before breakfast and was in her boots and cloak within minutes, directing 2 footmen to load blankets and dry wood onto the cart before Julian had even come down. He found her an hour later, wading calf deep in the Tanner yard with her skirts knotted up and her hair coming loose from its pins, helping the old woman's granddaughter carry a trunk of linens to the higher ground of the barn. The rain had not let up. Water stood brown and swift around the cottage's foundation, and old Mrs. Tanner sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket on an upturned crate, her 2 grandchildren pressed close against her sides, all 3 of them watching the flood with the particular exhausted patience of people who had seen hard winters before and expected to see more. Julian did not call out. He simply rolled his sleeves and waded in beside her, took the trunk from her hands without asking, and set to work. For the better part of that morning, the Earl of Ashcombe hauled sodden furniture and cut kindling alongside his tenants without once mentioning his rank, and when the youngest Tanner boy, no more than 6, grew frightened at the water rising past his knees, it was Julian who lifted him onto his shoulders and carried him the length of the yard, talking low and steady the whole way about nothing in particular. The weather, the horses, anything to keep the child from crying. Eleanor watched him from the corner of her eye, her arms full of wet linen, and thought that whatever else he was not a man who stood on ceremony when someone needed a dry roof and a steady voice. "You ought not have come out in this without telling me," he said afterward, as they rode back in the wet dusk, his voice low and even. "If the beck rises again in the night, you send for me. You do not go alone." It was not a request. Eleanor bristled at the shape of it for exactly as long as it took her to notice his eyes on her hands, chapped and raw from the cold water, his jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You were worried," she said, before she could stop herself. "I was informed my wife was standing in a flooded yard," he said. "Worry does not enter into it." His hand found her elbow as she dismounted all the same, steadying her on the wet stone, and lingered there a half-second longer than balance required. Eleanor felt the warmth of it travel up her arm long after he had let go, a warmth entirely out of proportion to so small a touch, and she was aware, walking into the house beside him, of the particular rhythm of her own pulse, quick and unfamiliar, and of how closely she had begun to listen for the sound of his step in a corridor before she saw him. She caught him, 3 days after the flood, standing at the edge of the walled garden watching young Peggy, the newest under-housemaid, weep into her apron on the kitchen steps. Lady Augusta had been at the house that morning, ostensibly to call on Eleanor, and had spent the visit informing the staff at large that once her son came into his rightful inheritance, as she was confident he would, the household would want considerably fewer superfluous girls kept on. Eleanor went to Peggy without a moment's hesitation, crouched in the mud in her good afternoon dress, and told the girl plainly that no one was dismissing her, that Lady Augusta had no authority over Ashcombe's staff and never would, and that if anyone tried to tell her otherwise, she was to come straight to Eleanor herself. "You have done nothing wrong," she said, taking the girl's cold hands in her own. "This house does not turn out good people for another woman's spite. I will see to it myself, Peggy, I give you my word." She did not perform kindness. She did not glance about to see who watched. She simply did what needed doing, the way she had done it for 4 years before anyone thought to marry her for it, and it was only when Peggy had gone in, dried and steadied, that Eleanor turned and found Julian watching from beneath the yew hedge, entirely still, his expression unguarded for the first time since his arrival. Something in his face that looked almost like a man recognizing a face he had been searching for without knowing it. He said nothing to her about it that day. That evening at dinner, he asked Mrs. Hartley, in front of the whole table, to confirm that Peggy's position was secure at his express wish, his tone even and final, brooking no further discussion of the matter. Eleanor understood, watching him, that he had needed to see her kindness with his own eyes before he would believe what the Ledgers and the tenants had already told him about the woman he had married, and that some private accounting had shifted in him that evening, quiet and unremarked, the way a scale settles once the true weight has finally been set upon it. It was 2 nights later that he told her about his brother. She found him in the long gallery near midnight, having heard his step on the stair when sleep would not come, and he did not send her away. He stood before a portrait of a fair-haired young man in hunting dress, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its usual level control. "His name was Robert," Julian said. "He was to be the Earl. I was the spare, and glad of it, because Robert was everything a title required, and I had no wish to be measured against him. We rode the wood past the garden wall the morning he died. I saw the ground give under his horse before he did. I called out. I believe I called out. I have told myself for 11 years that I called out in time, and some nights I no longer know if that is memory or mercy." He had left for his commission within the month, and had not returned to Ashcombe in the 11 years since, not for his cousin's fever, not for his uncle's decline, until a solicitor's letter and a will's deadline gave him no further choice. He believed, though he had never said it to another living soul, that the house had taken his brother because he himself had failed to shout loud enough, fast enough, and that whatever the tenants murmured about curses, the truth was smaller and worse. It was simply his. Eleanor did not tell him he was wrong, because she understood, better than most, that grief did not answer to argument. She stood beside him instead, close enough that her sleeve brushed his, and said only, "You were a boy on a horse behind another boy on a horse. That is not a curse, Julian. That is an accident, and you have carried it alone for 11 years because no one thought to take it from you." It was the first time she had used his given name without the shield of a title before it. He turned to look at her properly then, and the candle between them threw a warm, unsteady light across his face, and Eleanor became aware, in a rush that startled her, of the precise distance separating them, close enough to feel the warmth coming off him in the cold gallery, close enough to hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. "I did not think I would want anything from this marriage beyond civility," Julian said, low, his eyes not leaving hers. "I find I was wrong about that as well." "What do you want then?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I want," he said, and stopped, as though the word itself required more courage than he had expected to spend on it. His hand rose, nearly to her cheek, close enough that she felt the warmth of it before the touch, and then he stopped there too, his jaw tight, and let his hand fall back to the gallery rail instead. "It is too soon to ask you to want it in return," he said. "I will not make you answer for a feeling 3 months old, built on a will and a deadline neither of us chose. When you give me an answer, Eleanor, I would have it be a true one, not one owed to gratitude or to a candle at midnight." She understood, with a small ache she had not expected, that his restraint was its own kind of tenderness, the same instinct that had carried a frightened child on his shoulders through floodwater, and she let the moment pass unclaimed Though the space between their hands on the gallery rail had narrowed by degrees, neither of them chose to name, and neither of them moved away from it either. Edmund's petition arrived by post the following week, delivered by his mother's own hand and spoken aloud in the drawing room with evident relish. It claimed the marriage had been contracted under duress, hastily and improperly witnessed, and asked the county court to void it and restore the entail to its natural course. Lady Augusta did not trouble to disguise her satisfaction as she folded the letter away. "One does hate to see a young man burdened with a marriage he never chose," she said to the room at large, though her eyes were fixed on Eleanor. "Poor Julian, saddled with the encumbrance the will forced upon him, and now this unpleasantness besides. I understand entirely if he wishes it undone." Mrs. Hartley, standing near the door with a tray she had forgotten to set down, went white with anger on Eleanor's behalf. It was not the first Eleanor had heard of what Lady Augusta said in rooms she believed private. The cook's girl had carried word back to the kitchen only 2 days before, breathless with the particular guilt of a servant repeating what she ought not have overheard, that Lady Augusta had told a visiting cousin over cards that the new countess was nothing more than the encumbrance the will had forced upon her nephew, and that any sensible man would thank Providence for the chance to be rid of her cleanly. Eleanor had said nothing when the girl told her, only thanked her for her honesty, and sent her back to her work. But the word had lodged itself somewhere under her ribs all the same, a small cold stone she carried through 2 sleepless nights. Hearing it spoken now, a 3rd time, to her face, in her own drawing room, did not sting the way the first 2 times had stung. It settled instead, cold and clear, into something closer to resolve. Eleanor set down her needlework, folded her hands, and looked at Lady Augusta with a steadiness that made the older woman's smile falter for half a second before she recovered it. "You have called me that 3 times now, Lady Augusta," Eleanor said. "An encumbrance. I confess I begin to wonder whether the word troubles you more than it troubles me. An encumbrance, after all, is a thing one is stuck with against one's wishes. I have yet to hear my husband describe me so." Julian did not answer his aunt at all. He rose, crossed the room without a word, his face gone perfectly still in the way Eleanor had already learned meant he was holding something back with both hands, and left it. She did not see him again until well past dark, the house gone quiet around her, the candles burned low in their sconces along the hall, when she finally found him in the stable yard, saddling his horse in the moonlight, as though he meant to ride out and never come back. "You are leaving," she said. "I am thinking of what is owed to you," he said, not turning. "A petition that names our marriage improper will drag your name through every drawing room in the county, whether it succeeds or fails. I brought this house to your door already cursed, Eleanor. I will not watch it ruin you as well." "You did not bring the curse," she said. "There is no curse. There is a house full of frightened people who have been told for a decade that misfortune runs in the stone, and there is a family who has never once stopped to grieve properly. And there is you, standing in a stable yard about to abandon the one thing your uncle asked of you, because you have decided in advance that you will fail at it." He turned then, and his face in the moonlight was not the composed mask he wore at dinner. "I do not know how to be a husband to you," he said, low. "I did not choose you, and you did not choose me. And I have watched everyone I was ever meant to protect go into the ground while I stood by breathing." "Then choose me now," Eleanor said. "Not because a will demanded it. Because I am asking you to." "If I stay," Julian said, "and this house takes something else from me, from you, I do not know that I could bear having chosen it freely, rather than having it forced upon me. "That is not love speaking," Eleanor said. "That is fear wearing love's coat. I have watched fear run this house for a decade, Julian, in the servants who will not walk past the East Wood after dark, in your aunt who would rather see it fall to Edmund than risk it standing whole. I will not watch it run you as well." He did not answer her that night. He did not ride out either. He put the horse back in its stall, his hands moving slow and careful over the buckles, and stood with her in the cold yard a long while, close enough that she could see the argument still working behind his eyes, want and fear turning over each other without either winning outright. When at last his hand found hers in the dark, he did not draw her closer, though she felt in the sudden held stillness between them that he wanted to, and that the wanting cost him something to leave unspent. Neither of them let go until the frost had climbed halfway up the stable door, and neither of them spoke of what had very nearly happened and had not, because some things, Eleanor understood, needed to be earned in daylight before they could be trusted in the dark. The hearing was set for the county assizes the 3rd week of the new year, and Mr. Pemberton arranged instead, with the magistrate's blessing, for the matter to be settled privately at Ashcombe Hall itself, before witnesses of standing, so that the family's business need not become the county's entertainment. Snow had fallen in the night, and lay thick and unmarked across the moor when the carriages began arriving that morning, and Eleanor stood at the drawing-room window watching them come, counting the families whose good opinion had been the currency of her whole life at Ashcombe Hall, and thinking that whatever else happened before noon, she did not intend to leave that room having lied about who she was or what she wanted. Lady Augusta arrived with Edmund and a young solicitor of her own retaining, dressed as though for a triumph, her jet beating catching the gray winter light through the tall windows. The drawing-room filled with the neighboring families who had watched the Ashcombe name totter for a decade. Drawn by curiosity, they were too well-bred to name aloud, arranging themselves along the walls with the careful attention of an audience settling in for a play whose ending they had already guessed. Eleanor sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, and felt Julian take his place beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and did not look at him, because she was afraid that if she did, her composure would not survive it. Mr. Pemberton entered the will's marriage clause into the record, plain and unambiguous, and confirmed that the ceremony had been performed by special license, properly witnessed by 3 members of the household, within the 30 days the will required. Edmund's solicitor pressed the question of duress, of a marriage entered under a deadline neither party had chosen, and for a moment the room's attention swung toward Julian with the particular hunger of people waiting to see a man break. Julian rose. He crossed the room. Not quickly, each step deliberate on the old boards, and every head in the drawing-room turned to follow him the way a field of grain turns toward wind, until he stood before Eleanor, where she sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, and the whole assembled company went still around them, the way a room goes still before weather. Someone near the window let out a breath too loud for the silence. A log settled in the grate. Eleanor looked up at him and found at last that she was not afraid to. "Eleanor is my wife," Julian said. "She remains Countess of Ashcombe." 9 words, spoken plainly, without ornament, into a silence he had built by walking the length of the room to reach her. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at his aunt at all. He looked only at Eleanor, and something in his face had finally, entirely, stopped hiding. He held out his hand, and she took it, and rose to stand beside him in front of every family whose whispers had shaped her whole life at Ashcombe, and felt, for the first time she could remember, entirely and unmistakably seen. Lady Augusta's composure, so carefully maintained through every drawing-room encounter that season, cracked at last in front of the very people she had cultivated it for. She began to speak. Some remark about impropriety. And the words came out thin and scattered. And she stopped herself halfway through the sentence, aware for the first time that the room was not with her. Edmund, beside her, had the grace to look faintly ashamed. "Mr. Pemberton confirmed, for the record and for the county families listening, that the marriage stood entire and lawful, and that the petition, absent any true evidence of coercion beyond an inconvenient deadline both parties had honored freely, would not survive a hearing." It was over inside a quarter hour. Lady Augusta left without taking tea, which the assembled neighbors would discuss for weeks, and Edmund followed his mother out with the particular relief of a man glad to be released from a fight he had never truly wanted. Winter closed properly over the moor after that. The roads gone hard with frost, and the fields silvered each morning until noon. And Ashcombe Hall began, slowly, to feel less like a house holding its breath. Julian had the east wing opened at last, the shutters thrown back. Robert's portrait moved from the shadowed end of the gallery to a place of honor near the drawing-room hearth where the firelight could reach it. He walked the wood past the garden wall for the first time in 11 years, with Eleanor's hand in his, and said nothing when they reached the place where his brother had fallen, only stood a while with his head bowed before turning back toward the house without a backward glance, as though he had finally set something down that he no longer needed to carry alone. The tenants stopped speaking of curses sometime that spring, not because anyone declared it so, but because a house with its shutters open and its new countess walking its grounds each morning with mud on her hem and a basket on her arm did not much resemble the story they had been telling themselves. Peggy stayed on, and was joined by 2 more girls from the village who had heard the position was steady now. Old Mrs. Tanner's cottage was re-roofed before the first hard frost at the Earl's own expense, and the family never did learn whose idea that had been, though Mrs. Hartley had her suspicions. On a clear evening in April, with the windows open to let in the smell of new grass, Eleanor sat by the fire mending a torn hem, while Julian sat at the desk his uncle had once used, working through a stack of correspondence. The pocket watch that had been his brother's ticking steady beside his inkwell no longer stopped, set turning each morning now out of habit rather than grief. Eleanor's small silver thimble, the one her mother had left her, worked at the linen in her fingers, the same thimble she had worn on a ribbon at her waist the day of the rushed wedding in the fog, kept close through every difficult month since as the one thing in the house that had always, unquestionably, been hers. Julian looked up from his papers and watched her a moment in the firelight before she noticed. "What is it?" she asked, smiling despite herself. "I was only thinking," he said, "that the will asked a very great deal of a stranger, and gave me, in the end, considerably more than it promised." He rose and crossed to her, and drew her up from her chair, and this time there was no hesitation left in him to spend. He kissed her slowly in the firelight, with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who had learned, at great cost, exactly what he stood to lose, and had chosen, freely and entirely, to keep it. When at last he drew back, he rested his forehead against hers, and Eleanor felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm, and thought that she had spent 4 years believing herself an encumbrance to be managed, and had found instead, in the last 12 months, a home she had helped build with her own hands, and a man who had finally stopped mistaking his own survival for a debt owed to grief. Miss Hartley brought in the tea tray a little after, and found them still standing so, close together before the fire, and only smiled and set the tray down quietly upon the sideboard, and went out again without a word. As she had watched over this house and this girl for a dozen years and more, through funerals and floods and a wedding conducted in fog, and knew, better than most in that county, exactly what it meant to see a house finally settle. Outside the window, the moor lay quiet and green in the last of the light, holding nothing any more that either of them feared. The roses Eleanor had planted along the garden wall that first uncertain spring had taken root and climbed, thick with new buds not yet opened, and the tenants who once would not walk past the east wood after dark now let their children play there in the long summer evenings, their laughter carrying clear across the grounds to the house. If you had asked anyone in the village that April whether Ashcombe Hall was cursed, they would have laughed outright and told you to come see the roses for yourself, and the new countess kneeling among them with dirt on her hands and her husband's coat about her shoulders, and judge the house accordingly.